I speak 3 languages fluently and I know the basics of 7. You might be wondering, how is that possible? Well, here is my languages story and also my tips for learning languages. On a quick side story before the tips, I was very fortunate to be in a French speaking school when I was growing up. And so I grew up in Ecuador. So as I was growing up, I was exposed to both French and Spanish all the way from when I was 2 years old to when I was 17. And in this school, we also had later in high school many different options of other languages that I picked on that I will dive deeply into later. But yeah, I grew up speaking French and Spanish, and then when I was 8, I started learning English on Saturday mornings in an academia outside of school. My parents always wanted us to be really busy and kind of like learn many languages because they knew that they would open a lot of opportunities for us. So I started learning English when I was 8, and I learned it all the way until when I was like 14, 15, and by that time I was fluent. And then in high school, I started learning Portuguese, and I picked German on Saturdays mornings as well. And then after that, I came to Vancouver for university. I studied university here. It was definitely a challenge to do school fully in English because I had never done it before. I studied in French and Spanish before. So it was definitely a challenge, but I made it through. In university, I also took a course of Italian, and I also took the basics of Russian in the app Duolingo. Ultimately, also my partner is from India, so I'm also picking on Hindi and some Punjabi, and that's pretty much it. So I speak fluent English, French, and Spanish, and I can confidently speak fluently in those 3 languages. Um, I know some basics of Portuguese and Italian, which are very easy if you speak Spanish, and some German I can understand more than what I can speak. And then I know the fundamentals of Russian and the fundamentals of Hindi as well. So here's my advice for learning languages and getting better at your everyday discussions and your writing and reading, etc. So first, I was a big fan of learning languages through watching movies. And actually, when I was in high school and I had to pass my Portuguese examinations of like the level of proficiency that we were at, which is like B2 or something, I think. I binge watched this Netflix series called 3%, which we can insert a picture right here. And it's this Brazilian slash Portuguese Netflix series about this group of people that are living in like a utopia. Anyway, it was very interesting, but more importantly, it was in Portuguese. So I watched that series for like 3 days before my exams, and I was just like thinking in Portuguese, like dreaming in Portuguese, like I was immersed in the series, in the world of the series. And because the world of the series happens in Portuguese, I was immersed in Portuguese. So it made it so much easier to speak. And when the day of my exam came, I was like confidently writing because I was also watching it with subtitles. So watch it with subtitles. And I was also speaking my exam, and I was confident. So that's my first tip. Tip number 2 is to learn common phrases that come into conversations repetitively. So the phrases are at the beginning and the end of different conversations that you can hear someone that is native from that language have, such as, for example, hello, how are you? Or let's go, or got it, or bless you. Those little types of expressions make it fun to remember a language whenever you're going through your day. And for example, somebody sneezes and you remember that in German that is Gesundheit, or in Hindi, like, say my partner is with me and we're going somewhere and he's kind of like running late, and then telling him like, let's go. And in Hindi, that is chalo. So I'm like, chalo, chalo. So I'm like, let's go. So that is very fun to incorporate into your daily life. And it's the easiest way in which you can remember different languages without any effort, just kind of by being in those situations, but having that word in your brain. My tip number 3 would be to get exposed to the culture and the stories of the people of that country. If it's a specific country, such as, for example, India, then you can do that. If it's, a language that's spoken across many different countries like Spanish in Latin America, then you can just like dive into Latin American music and food. And it's the same with, different languages like Persian, Chinese, English. So get immersed into the culture and get curious about how did that people come about? Where do they come from? What are their stories? What are their religions? What's the food? What do people wear every day? What do they like? What do they don't? So get really curious and immerse into the culture and to the history of that country or that region. And it's going to make you remember facts and remember keywords that you find through your research more easily, because as humans we remember stories more than what we remember just random facts here and there. My tip number 4 would be get Duolingo, which is obviously not a sponsor in this video, but Duolingo did help me to learn the basics of Russian. I tried to learn Hindi with it, but because you have to learn Sanskrit, it was not that easy. But you can learn the basics of many different languages, especially if they have the same alphabet as like English, for example. It's the same alphabet as in Spanish or French or Portuguese. So when it's the same alphabets, Duolingo is especially great to be able to immerse yourself in finding those little sentences. Again, it's not a complete, I would say, way into which you're going to become fluent. But if you want to learn the basic structure of a language, like for example Russian, it's great. I learned a few different sentences that I still remember just by being curious of the Russian language, which I learned because I just really loved the way that it sounded. So you can just get curious of how do you say how are you in Russian, and it's как дела. So you can learn all those little things that I talked about before, like those little expressions, through Duolingo. Just like it's free, you can download the app and you can select the language that you're interested in learning and just start learning that language today. And my tip number 5 would be to make it a year project or like 2-year project to learn a certain language, especially if that language is more complex and something that you're totally unfamiliar with. For example, for me, that would be something like an Asian language like Korean or Chinese, Japanese, or Hindi, which, like, it has a different alphabet, it has a different way of moving your mouth and all these different expressions. Like, it's going to take you a bit of time, and you're really going to need to dedicate yourself into learning this language and immersing yourself in this culture. So I would say make it a project. And if by the end of that year or those 2 years you can have a trip planned to that country, that is going to make it even so much more exciting to go into that country and immerse yourself into that language. One language that I forgot that I spoke very little of, but I immersed myself into for a little second, was Luganda, because I lived in Uganda for 3 months last year. So when I was going into Uganda, I made it a point to learn some Ugandan. And I still remember, for example, Masuseotia, which is like good morning. A couple years ago when I was in university, I was learning Italian, and at the end of the semester in which I was learning Italian, I was traveling to Italy to visit some friends. So that made it so much more exciting to learn Italian, because I was picturing like my time in Italy and how I was going to be able to use the sentences that I was learning to order an ice cream or just food at an Italian restaurant. in Italian, which was so exciting. So I really recommend you make it a project and you have a really good reward for yourself at the end to make it inspiring to dive into this language and give it all of your effort. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If you found this video useful, give it a like and subscribe if you want, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.